Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Wang, Senior Director of AI at Turnitin. Thank you for attending our panel today, Mind the Ethical Edge, Delivering Equal and Unbiased AI. It's no secret to anyone here that AI, data, and technology are rapidly transforming education and edtech. These changes have profound implications on how future leaders, doers, creators, and discoverers are learning and augmenting the skills and knowledge today to put to use to solve the challenges of tomorrow. At the same time, these changes highlight some important open questions around fairness, accessibility, and equity about data and AI. I'm really proud to be joined by an esteemed panel today to discuss some of these open questions. So joining us on stage, in no particular order, is Jim Larimore, Chief Officer for Equity and Learning at Riiid Labs, Laurie Forcier, Chief of Staff and Director of Partnerships at Educate Ventures Research, Taniya Mishra, Founder and CEO of SureStart, and last but not least, and definitely tallest, Fernando Rodriguez-Villa, CEO and co-founder of AdeptID. So we'll launch right into it. First, I wanted to, for the purposes of this discussion, just quickly define AI and what we mean. So for us, AI, we are defining it as simply mathematical functions that interpolate and sometimes slightly extrapolate statistical patterns from data. AI, in our context, is entirely, that's a really good definition, entirely dependent on data. And so when you think about that, and you think about AI, one of the first questions that we hear about is AI bias. You hear about it in magazines, you hear about it on TV, you hear about it in these conferences. So Taniya, picking on you to start, when you hear AI bias, a term that's so big and carries so much weight, what comes to mind? And what are some of the impacts that you think about when you hear the term AI bias?
When I hear the, sorry, I should probably, it's on. Yeah, okay. When I hear the term AI bias, honestly, the first thing that comes to mind is actually its impact. The word that kept floating through my head was harms, right? Like whenever we consider AI bias, it doesn't even have to be about AI. When we just hear the word bias, it is almost always in the context of harms, where certain viewpoints, certain assumptions, implicit, explicit, just things that are in our blind spots have in some way disadvantaged someone else. And so that's really what I think about when I hear the word AI bias. See, I said AI harms because to me, those are so intertwined.
Thank you so much. So when we talk about harm and AI bias, I guess the immediate question is AI bias always necessarily harmful? We'll kind of open this up to the whole panel. Is it wrong? I mean, the bias presented by an AI representing the data is generated by society. So are there cases where it is very harmful, and we want to definitely address those? I think we understand that. But are there cases where that bias might be more benign? Please.
So when I hear AI bias, the first thing I think is human bias. Because the thing that's driving any kind of bias that exists, of course, sits at the human level. For example, my company, Educate Ventures Research, is based in the UK. We had a recent, very highly publicized exam scandal, and everyone thought it was a rogue algorithm. And of course, it wasn't. The algorithm did what it was supposed to do. The algorithm didn't have bias. It was the way that it was set up, the way that it was structured and programmed. So bias is always going to be human-driven. But to the question of will it always be harmful, no, I don't think it always will be. But it is very likely to be the case that it can be harmful if you're not thinking through intentionally, what you're doing. So it's like in that unintentional sort of invisible bias where you think that's the norm without really interrogating that, that's where you run into problems.
Yeah, and I would kind of build on Laurie's point. When I hear AI bias, I tend to think about this in sort of three separate categories, right? One is around potential bias in the data, especially training data that gets used to inform AI models, potential for bias in the algorithms, which I think is a part of what you're describing. If you do have a blind spot, and if you're not paying attention to the population that you're serving, what it is that you're trying to help address or remedy, then there's a potential for the algorithm itself to be problematic. And as a sociologist, kind of living in a world of technologists, I think what I fear in that is that AI can enlarge the scope and the speed of the problem, right? We can affect more people, and we can literally discriminate at the speed of light, right, for that. And then the third piece of this, which I think is something that as an industry we probably need to pay attention to, is also bias in the way that AI tools are used or that feedback from AI systems are interpreted, which takes us right back to the first trap, which is, what do people know? If you look at the world of education as an unbiased activity, then you'll think that the way that things are today is the norm, right? This is good. This is as good as it has been. As an American Indian person who has had a very different experience with education in the U.S. And the way that schooling was used to try to take us away from our cultures, I think of, schooling has never been a utopian environment where everyone has everything that they need in order to succeed. So there are systems and processes that have been biased that we've inherited. And the big question for us is, are we bold enough to name those things and to push them out into the sunlight so that we can start to decide what the distinction is between what we've inherited and what we want our children or our grandchildren to inherit.
I think this is where it gets interesting for those of us that are like practitioners of AI, right? And saying like, well, the AI or even bias itself, frankly, isn't necessarily bad. It's just a blind spot and a kind of a frailty that ends up getting reflected and often magnified to the extent that it stays blind. And so I think, I like that kind of framing of the different stages of, okay, there's the training data stage, there's the algorithms themselves, and then there's the impact or the way that they're used in the world. And you have opportunities to actually test at each of those phases to say, okay, is there bias here? What was the outcome that it led to? And then that ability to kind of measure bias in terms of impact makes it a lot more actionable, because otherwise it's just scary. And this technology is kind of inevitable in one form or another, and so kind of trying to take it and make it something that's useful and productive, it just comes down to that attention to testing, which is not, it's not uncommon in other realms of technology, right? Any new function in an API, and we build a lot of APIs, right? You build unit tests around it. So you wouldn't put something into production without having a natural testing framework around it to make sure it's working well. I think similar practices just need to find their way into how AI is put into the world.
So you mentioned something really, really interesting, which is testing the algorithms in the real world. But then we also mentioned something perhaps not contradictory, but on the other side of the fence, which is, well, whenever we put something like this out, it has an impact on students. So I want to touch on evaluation, not assessment of students, but evaluation of these algorithms a little bit. How do you A/B test, or how do you RCT, or how do you measure efficacy in a way that's ethical and moral, recognizing that there are real learners that are going to be impacted?
I think I'll answer that question, but I also want to kind of react to something that Fernando said. Sorry. Yes, I wanted to react to something that Fernando said. And I don't want to give AI a pass so early in this conversation. AI is supposed to be a neutral machine. It is supposed to be something that helps technology live up to its promise to make our lives more efficient, help us to access information easier, maybe even accomplish tasks more collaboratively and faster, and at the same time, move us all towards this, new economy, the new green. Everyone's calling AI the new green. Yet AI, both in its practice directly as its everyday implications and broader implications on society and communities, continues to be one that discriminates, penalizes, and excludes entire groups of people in many different ways. So, as a practitioner of AI, I will say, yes, there are it certainly has great promise, but I think it's conversations like this that really help us to be more rigorous in how we practice it, right? And that relates to also the question that you said, how do we, technology is going to be used, ML, AI, data science, all of these are going to be parts of the new solution. And yet, how do we use it in a way that's ethical? And I think it goes back to conversation, transparency, and clarity, right? If we are going to do A/B testing, then it is important that the audience, the people on whom we are going to do this kind of testing, is aware that it is happening. I understand that there will be certain challenges to how we evaluate those tests, but that said, at the university level, when we were in grad school, or at least when I was in grad school, which was in 2006, 2007, around that time frame, you have to let people that are going to participate in your tests know the broader framework, right? And we've always done that. So why would we not do it when it is, really our children in front of us, or just entire communities of people?
Yeah, I think what Taniya has said here about making sure that humans are really aware and part of that conversation is really critical, and points to the need to expand general knowledge and understanding about AI, particularly amongst the educator community. The other thing I would say, when you were asking that question, Eric, it made me think, okay, well, there are three options. If you say, okay, is it ethical to test this technology? So one is you don't use the technology. Two is you don't test it. Or three, you do. And so out of those three, to me, the most ethical then does seem to be that you do test it. And that's part of the work that we do at Educate Ventures Research, is work with companies to help them get a better understanding of data and evidence, and build out, frameworks, almost research frameworks, really, a basic logic model to help them understand, what do they think they're doing? What do they think that they're, if it's an AI algorithm or another component of their technology, what do they think it does? And how can they test if it does the thing they think it does for the reasons they think it does it? It's so kind of a very basic sort of efficacy model. And, how do you build that capacity so that more companies are doing that on an ongoing basis?
Well, I think that a lot of the work that you're doing hopefully makes its way into the broader marketplace too, right? So there are a lot of technology providers at this conference, or investors at this conference, et cetera. Like, I think we try to kind of think about a more educated buying base for AI products, right? And so there's this kind of big three of like, one, companies will come purporting to sell AI, okay, but like, what kind of AI is it? There's actually like a huge range of different approaches within AI, and some of them are more transparent than others. Some are, purport to different metrics of accuracy, et cetera. So like, actually kind of like push on like, well, when you say AI, what do you really mean? The second one is, what are you doing to mitigate bias, right? So everyone should have an answer. If you're selling something and you have AI on the tin, you say, like, this is how we think about training data, how we think about the algorithms we pick, et cetera. And then finally, like, how good is it at those purported measures of success? Like, if what you're trying to do is accuracy, like, show us some back testing. Like, I think like algorithms have been sold in other verticals and are held to a higher standard, frankly, than they are in education for like, do they work at what you want them to? Sorry.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those areas where the problem looks different depending on where you're sitting, right, or what elevation you're looking at this from. So I would say if we pull up to 30 or 50,000 feet, they're really systemic kind of structural issues. Right? And how would you do the testing, and who's interested in what kinds of efficacy evidence? Who has the outcomes data that needs to be matched with this learning system data, right? What are the risks that people have or that they perceive that they have, and are any of those remediable, right? Can you work your way through them? And this is, I think, where one of a challenge at an event like the ASU+GSV Summit is, I think investors' interests are not necessarily perfectly aligned with the interest of parents or schools, right? And at the same time, we can't get to the bigger wins if we don't figure out how we align things within this ecosystem so that we can test things out, and I think try to work our way towards an understanding of at least what I would say is the big question, which is, how do we find the right tools to use with the right students and in the right context? Because we're probably not going to have a single tool or resource that works universally well for every learner out there, right? There may be some tools that are great for English language learners. And if that's the case, there's a market for that, right? There's an audience that really needs that, but it may not be the tool that you're selling into a general English language arts curriculum, right? And so I think this is one of those areas where I'm hoping that we can operate in the same sandbox and figure out what the rules are that we play by, and then figure out the systems and layers of connection that we're going to need to have. It's one of the reasons why a number of organizations that are represented in this room came together recently to launch the EdSafe AI Alliance to say, this is a cross-sector, multi-stakeholder conversation that needs to happen, and it has to happen around the whole planet. Right at the same time. And the only way into it, I think, is for us to get into rooms like this where we can talk pretty openly about what the challenges are so that we can then start to break it down into some actionable approach that we can take.
So I want to dive into that just a little bit. Specifically, the interesting thing is we're having the conversation about AI, and every single time we have a conversation around AI, it circles back to data, because data is the lifeblood of AI. So when we talk about data, and we look at the challenges, you mentioned Jim, the EdSafe coalition. What are some of the challenges that you had, and how did you solve them in terms of bridging these silos? And what opportunities did you see once you started connecting these pieces together?
Yeah, I appreciate the way you led into that, Eric, and I would say we haven't solved it yet. I think where we are, I would say that we go into the work realizing that we're much, much closer to the beginning than we are to the middle or anywhere near the end, right? So our approach has been to basically have conversations with a variety of people and different roles and different organizations from different countries, identify the fact that we all agree that this is something where we need to be working together on it. And what we found was that there was really a first mover problem. There are networks of people and organizations in different parts of the world that were starting to get into these conversations, but it was a voluntary activity, and it was sporadic. And so what we have done, Riiid has stepped up to underwrite some of the initial startup costs to have the Alliance begin its work, recruit additional members, start to build out a more complete stakeholder profile. And we've hired a managing director who has led the European EdTech Alliance and done some similar work. We're looking at having people that we can bring on board as consultants to help support the working groups that really have to, that's where the subject matter experts will be. Every single one of the subject matter experts has a more than full-time day job, right? So we want to figure out how can we remove some friction and push the work forward and just keep building momentum and getting more and more and kind of, I'd say, a more diverse set of voices into the conversation.
Great, thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of getting a little bit more into the weeds now, the nuts and bolts of how we actually might build good AI, or at least begin the process of building good AI. And these touch on topics such as governance, data interoperability, as well as operational values and organizational values that we might hold. So I'll start with the notion of something maybe a little bit controversial you just said, Jim, at ASU+GSV, which is the investor's goals are not always tied to the learner's goals. I don't actually think that's controversial. I think everyone understands what you're trying to say there. So I'll open it up. I'm going to pick somebody. Laurie, I'll pick on you. Are our KPIs, are the things that we're measuring not right? In the AI industry, we spend all this time chasing state of the art, but should we be chasing something more holistic? Should we be thinking about targets or measurements or metrics that are more in service of the public good? And if so, how might we get there?
So let me just ask you a question back. Should who be measuring? Who's our audience here? Are you talking about investors? Are we talking about companies? Are we talking about educators? Whose KPIs?
That is a fantastic question, and I think the answer, my answer, since I'm being put on the spot, is we need to come up with a set of KPIs that align everybody. That as humans, as members of society, in all of our disparate roles and occupations, we all agree pursuing learning, pursuing skills growth in this direction and measuring it in these ways is beneficial to all of us. So that's the holy grail. Of course, I know we're not there, but I wanted to get a sense of, from that 50,000-foot level, what should we be measuring that makes sense from a business point of view as well as from a learning point of view?
It's my point of view, and I think increasingly I'm hearing this from investor audiences as well. That they care about learning outcomes and they want to be able to demonstrate impact in a way that is, what's the right word I'm looking for?
ROI driven.
Yeah, not well, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, ROI driven actually is a good way of thinking about it, but then splitting how you think about ROI in between, financial, and impact goals. So that's one way of coming at it. But what I was going to say, in like a structured way, is there? It feels like there's increasingly an audience for, okay, how would we do this? How would we support our portfolio companies, for example, in really developing, having a really strong evidence mindset so that we could be able to demonstrate, whether the, learning outcomes that were predicted are happening and, the learner outcomes are there. So that's one piece of it. In terms of, I've lost my train of thought now. I'm going to toss it over to somebody else.
I guess, Laurie, one of the things that we were saying makes me think a bit about is, a lot of the education, quote unquote, industry, I feel like has kind of confused education as an end in itself rather than, I think, from the perspective of a lot of learners, particularly in the segment that we work with, which is much more kind of vocational or adult learning, like the end isn't necessarily finishing the course, it's getting the job that you were being trained for. And so I think making sure that the kind of what a successful outcome is aligned a little bit better. The quality of the data on actual kind of employment outcomes for vocational training has been so poor. And so it means that like anything you're doing from a modeling or an AI perspective also kind of has a ceiling to how helpful it can be.
Yeah.
So is the answer to that governance? Is the answer to that government oversight? Or
so I think stakeholders, should take a step back in a lot of these instances and say, like, well, what are the outcomes that the real stakeholders want to achieve? Like a student in a welding course doesn't care as much about graduating as they do about becoming a welder on the other end, right? Like, and so trying to kind of reward the training institution for graduating a student, even if they're not doing a good job of placing them, through federal support, et cetera, like those are just like really misaligned incentives. But what's interesting is like we're talking about something that's like much more of a policy question than an AI one, but because the models and the AI ultimately reflect the state of the world and the way that those incentives have been set up, like they can only kind of be successful if the stakeholders are set up the right way.
So how do you measure learning outcomes? Oh, I'm sorry, Jim. I didn't mean to interrupt. I
was going to try to build on Fernando's point because I think. And this was kind of trained into me, I think, during my time at the Gates Foundation, where we thought of, policy is the lever that you pull when you're ready to scale, right? When you're really ready to put public dollars to work and increase adoption or move to scale. And initially, I think both strategic philanthropists and investors are the groups that are able to fund the innovation, right? But then you've got to figure out which I and ROI are we focusing on? Return on investment, return on impact. What kind of impact or efficacy evidence do we need in order to keep something in play? And I think at the end of the day, whatever your tax status is, if you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, you have to have something that has a positive impact that you can demonstrate, and you have to have a sustainable financial model, right? Those, if you don't, you're a flash in the pan, and things will go away.
And I want to sort of add to Jim's point and ground that question around impact and evaluation back into sort of the technology evaluation. So basically, how do you measure the efficacy of your algorithm, your model, right? And in schools, especially at the graduate school level, when you're writing papers, there's a lot of focus on beating state of the art, right? You beat state of the art, you get a paper out, eventually if you're in industry, you get a patent or what have you. But the question is, it's not just what do you beat state of the art on? What is that, held out set, that test set? I think the thing that has gotten ignored for a long time is generalizability, right? And this is where I think the sort of incentives or, value structure, whether it is of investment dollars or families or parents or educators, all comes together is generalizability. If you're ultimately building an infrastructure, a process, a product that is able to serve all of your market, then it's great for the communities. Everyone's sort of interests are being taken into account. They are receiving a product that meets their goals. It's great for the company. More of your product is getting sold. It's awesome for the investor because you're getting better returns on your dollar. So I think looking at generalizing as a goal rather than just beating state of the art is something that we need to be teaching at the graduate school level and taking it into industry around those questions around evaluation. And some of it has to do with education itself for the stakeholders, right? When somebody presents you with, I am 90% better than X, well, the question is, okay, but 90% better than X on what data? It kind of keeps coming back to those questions around data. If we are going to use exemplar-based learning and then evaluation on examples, then those examples become really important.
Please.
I wanted to make one more point, and I think that this is coming back kind of full circle to the beginning of your question around the key outcomes or the key indicators, and the discussion around do we measure or do we have policy and But I think this is a unique situation where we have the desire that's been longstanding to be able to measure different attributes of success. And Eric, this is something you and I talked about a little bit. We've had a project recently where we've been able to help a university get at a finer grained look of how and when their students were learning how to learn. And now that's really exciting, and that was achieved through AI-driven data analyses, and we'll continue to build on that work. So now you have a technology that can help you get inside learning and look at an element of learning that everyone has said, actually, this is a really important transferable skill. This is something we want to assess and understand, in addition to knowing about content, and could potentially inform policy in some really interesting ways if you can crack that on an ongoing basis. Those sorts of more complex phenomena that we've had a hard time putting our thumb on previously.
So kind of circling back, and thank you all of you for that amazing answer. It was far deeper than I expected, and I really loved it. But I wanted to build on one piece. We are at ASU+GSV, and obviously we are as an investor conference. One of the conversations that we've all had is fair AI or more equitable AI as a competitive differentiator, right? And Taniya, you mentioned something about generalizability, and when I think about generalizability in the space of equity, it may mean that we actually have built models that underperform against state of the art. I think all of us understand that. But we say, well, state of the art for whom? And that's a valuable question. So how do you have that conversation with all the stakeholders? And stakeholders not just being the users, learners, or educators, but board members, product designers. How do you bring everybody on board? I mean, what's practically when you've sat down and said, hey, we're going to deploy something that it's not going to be at the very top of the Kaggle leaderboard, but I think it's going to make a dent. What do you do? Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, I'll walk you through the process that I actually had to use with my leadership team at a startup I was at prior to my current company, SureStart, where we actually tied leadership bonuses as well as other incentives to not just building the shiniest ML model, but again, how do we assess potentials for bias? Because again, these are exemplar-based statistics ultimately that we are doing. There are no bad intentions, there's just bad data in it. And so, we have to assess what are the potentials for accidental bias, and how do you go about mitigating it? And then what are you putting in place if you are, once you have sort of found those areas of challenge really for the product. And it was through lots and lots of conversations, lots of discussions around why this was important. But again, it kind of goes back to that education piece. We all needed to come to a common agreement, which required us to kind of step back and be on the same page with common understanding around these ideas. And so, because you hear a lot about AI and you may have a business understanding of the efficacy it brings, doesn't necessarily always mean that we all understand sort of the deeper technical challenges as well as ways in which we might need to mitigate them. So I think it, again, goes back to sort of us getting on the same page, hearing everyone's concerns, asking the right questions, asking the hard questions, and then holding ourselves accountable to it.
So I think particularly if you're kind of in a B2B context, selling models or something that has AI, right? There is, I think, some more progress to be made on educating, right, the buyer a bit. So like, again, people have this myopic idea that a good model is accurate. Well, accurate, especially in a backtesting context, just means that it's like perpetuating however things have been in the training set. And like often that's not what anyone wants, right? If you're trying to like hire from a new pool of people, then an accurate model is the opposite of what you're looking for. And so, if you're prioritizing accuracy over something like interpretability, you could give a customer an answer. They say, "Oh, why did the model go up?" And you say, "Well, I have no idea. Like it was a black box." And so, like if you're telling people that there are real trade-offs in how you're going to assess your model, whether you care about interpretability, whether you care about different notions of fairness, like I think that kind of can move the conversation away from like this very kind of one-dimensional accuracy, state of the art, as good or bad. And I think it makes it much more satisfying to be paying for something like that. And so the customers will kind of learn to think about this way. I mean, the analogy that we use a lot is in cars. 40 or 50 years ago, like people didn't really think about safety features as a thing when they were going shopping. And now if you go buy any car, right, you want to know it has assisted cruise control. You want to know that it has, automatic braking, anti-lock brakes. Like buyers are just going to get smarter about these things because the companies that play offense and define what ethical AI looks like are going to win. And that's why I think like one of the challenges in a commercial, like most of these ethical AI conversations can get very intrinsically defensive because there is like a tremendous potential for harm. But I think the winning companies and the winning entrepreneurs and investors who are thinking about the next generation of AI companies are going to say like, okay, who's going to like really make safety their brand the way Volvo did, or the way that the analogous companies in other sectors have. So I think that there's like a reason to get excited about ethical AI. Like we should be investing in like how do we hire the best data scientists to get them to work just on this as how we can beat other companies.
Yeah. When I think of this, I just recently had the chance to rewatch Apollo 13. Right? And you think about all of the ambition and the focused energy and intellectual talent that had to be directed to create a rocket system that was able to send people to the moon and get them home safely. I kind of feel like we're at that early stage in some lab, someplace in a movie like that, thinking about how AI can be used to improve education, which means we're going to fail a lot. And we should not be shy. We may have to think about who's in the room when we talk openly about our failures, because there can be a reverb or some pushback on some of that. But I think collectively, the goal is improve learning, right? Make it easier, more effective, more efficient for people to get the training. And I think as we think about AR and VR, kind of starting to get folded into this, to have a training experience that is close to what people will actually be doing so that they can see themselves in the future, right? So that they have a clear path for how they might get there. And it is going to require researchers helping us think at the beginning of how you design a piece of work so that you can actually measure or kind of see whether you're on track or not, and have an evaluation at the end that you can use to drive the next round of improvement.
So I mean, when we had our pre-panel call, so full disclosure, we all knew each other for a little bit before. Fernando, I believe it was you, but you said something that made me think a lot. It said, best case, AI is built by a bunch of benevolent dictators today. I believe it was you. It sounds like something you would say. And I think then I said, well, what do we do about that? Because I think we can all agree that's probably not what we want. dictatorship in general, benevolent or otherwise, is not what we should be aiming for. So what's the solution? And I think one thing was, we talked about federated ownership, but what does that mean? I mean, what does sort of governance look like in this space to push back against that?
I'll just start. I think, we were talking about it in the context of governance, and I think one of the challenges of looking to the developers of AI technology as the kind of the source of decisions, whether that's about, I don't know, financial trading or hiring decisions or learning recommendations, et cetera, is like, you're ultimately beholden to the people who develop the software, and we're all well aware that's not a very representative set today, as much as we'd like to change that and are investing to do that. So in that situation, you kind of hope that the people who developed it did it in everyone's interest, but it's kind of a hope, right? Like there needs to be ways to kind of push governance out to the edge, right? Out to the people who are the practitioners. And so I think that's where there are kind of exciting ideas that are getting thrown around now. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And so in the meantime, it all comes back to transparency. Like anyone developing a model has to be super clear about where the data is coming from, what are the actual techniques that they're doing. We should be pushing everyone to have public documentation, not just of how an endpoint works, but of what the modeling approach is. And if they don't have that, you shouldn't buy their stuff. Like, I think that's kind of this transparency, whatever, during this intermediate period needs to be there.
So I'm going to ask, as we kind of get to the end of this panel, I'm going to ask Laurie the buck stops here question. And we live in a world where obviously, as in the pharmaceutical industry, the efficacy of drugs is regulated. Is regulation, legislation, oversight of AI, data provenance and all of that, is it inevitable in your opinion?
Well, it's already happening in some sectors, and increasingly, certainly in the UK and Europe, and I think globally, we're seeing more and more of a push for, you need to have transparency as to, why the system has made the decision it does, say, for example, in like a high-stakes decision-making scenario. So that transparency is not only becoming more important and more wanted, it's becoming legislated. Now, right now, that doesn't exist in ed tech in any serious way, and it means we're operating in a little bit of a vacuum. There's no low bar, there's no high bar, so people who are trying to do the best that they can by their learners, are doing the best that they can, but without a framework to know where to aim at, and that's a real challenge. So I think regulation not only should become, it is probably coming, but it should be coming.
So we have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds. What is the one piece of advice, then, you would give to audience and practitioners here in terms of the AI that they're working on or they're going to build to make it more equitable? What is the one thing you can do today? So I'll start with you, Jim.
I would say, so one of the things that we've tried to do within Riiid is recognize that our AI researchers and our software engineers or other engineers they are not the student who we are trying most to help, right? These are people who have, on our AI team and our engineering teams, school has worked for them. They're not the normative student model for us. So what we've done is to have people get out to engage with teachers, to go visit schools, to think about the kids who they grew up with who didn't make it, right? The students who may have struggled or not gotten the attention and support that they needed, and to then start thinking about who we need to include in our design process.
Laurie?
So I'm really taken by, and I'm going to ask Jim more about this afterwards, the coalition that he's working on. And there are similar activities afoot in the UK around, do we start to tap all of the data that exists out there for the good of all by compiling them into something like an education data trust that can then be overseen by an arm's length governance kind of body. That's an idea that's making the rounds right now that I think is really, really exciting. So to those of you who are working in this space, looking outward to think about how you can contribute to that pooling, that building of education banks or lakes or whatever you want to call it, so that we start to get a bigger, broader picture of this kind of question of what works for students, of a certain type, or in a different school, in a certain context. That's what I would encourage for everyone here.
Taniya?
I'll say let's take it back to those teams, those benevolent dictators that build the technology. The time is now. Let's all work towards making those teams as representative as possible. I mean, change that equation, because ultimately, the better those teams represent our communities, our world, the better whatever those teams build and design is going to be for all of us. And so I would say for everyone listening in, join people like Fernando and me. We are working as hard as we can to change that equation. We would love to talk to you if you have thoughts, ideas, or want to partner with us.
Fernando?
Yeah, I think don't be afraid to be transparent. I think particularly for the entrepreneurs out there, there's a very old world mentality of like, oh, if we're working on something technology-like or innovative, we have to be protective of what's proprietary, et cetera. In this space, actually, like the more open you are about how you're doing stuff, what ingredients you're using, et cetera, the stronger you are. And customers notice and investors notice. So like, don't be afraid to be transparent. I think that's the long-term winning strategy in any of these things.
Great. So I just wanted to put in a shameless plug. If you check your schedules, Wednesday morning at 10:10 a.m., there is a session listed as a teacher-centered conversation about AI in education. And if you're concerned or interested in this topic, love to see you again.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. And I want to thank the panelists again. Thank you for your time.